I want to share a little bit about why I'm so excited to talk about networking here, because realistically, this is one of the single most underrated attributes of recruiting. And so I'll tell you a little bit of a story about my first time recruiting for on-cycle private equity interviews. And so this was kind of back in the day. I won't date myself by saying the exact year, but it happened on Halloween. And I remember that we were all dressed up in our costumes at parties and stuff, and headhunters started calling us, and they were saying like, oh Max, like come to this interview, and you had to like choose rapidly and throw on a suit and hope that you were like ready to go on your LBOs and whatnot. But there was one firm in particular that was my absolute dream firm. And it was a very hypey fund that today has fallen out of grace. But it was very, very cool. They were doing a ton of deals. They were raising a ton of money. Like it was super prestigious. And I was set on them. So I had networked with probably 10 to 15 different people at that firm. And pretty quickly, what I realized was that I wasn't getting the call. Like the headhunter just straight up did not call me about that firm, even though I'd done so much networking. And so what I do? Well, I picked up the phone. I called all those people and I was like, hey, like I know that you guys are interviewing. I've heard about it. I'm super stoked about your fund. Here's the deal I just closed. Here's an updated resume. Here's all this good stuff. Is there any chance I can be included in the process? And it was pretty funny because about 10 minutes later, the headhunter started calling me and they were like, Max, like, I don't know what just happened, but like, get down to that fund. Like, you've got to get there ASAP. Everyone's telling me that you need to interview. And so I was really, really clearly able to see the power of the networking that I had done beforehand. And honestly, that's more true than ever, especially in a world where you get hundreds of thousands of people applying for all of the same investment banking and private equity jobs. Acceptance rates are declining. And what really makes people stand out is the relationships that they have. And I don't mean that in like a slimy nepotistic way. I mean that in a very genuine way, where at the core of all recruiting is the ability to get people to like you, get them to understand you, and be able to communicate who you are as an individual. And so today, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how you can communicate yourself to other people, get yourself in front of as many people as possible, build genuine relationships, and make sure that when your time comes, that you're prepared to actually pick up the phone and get the interview that you're looking for. So just a little context on me, so you know that I am walking the walk in addition to talking the talk. My name is Max Adams. I'm the head coach of Wall Street Mastermind, and I have a background in investment banking and private equity. I spent the beginning of my career at Lazard and Catalyst, which are two tech boutiques in San Francisco, before making my way to Vector Capital, where I climbed up to senior associate and eventually received VP sponsorship towards Stanford GSB for business school and the Harvard Kennedy School for an MPA. And so that's what I've been up to for the last decade or so before joining Wall Street Mastermind. But more relevant to all of you, during that time, I've been super passionate about helping other people to replicate the success that I've had in breaking into the finance industry. And this is a harder industry than ever before to break into. Acceptance rates at top banks like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs are sub 1%. And so it's literally harder to get into investment banking now than it was harder for me to get into Harvard, if you can believe that. And so the core thing that I've really loved communicating with students, though, is how to build these relationships. And during the last decade or so, I've probably had about 1,200 coffee chats myself, reaching out to other people. And I've had a similar number of coffee chats with students reaching out to me and mentoring calls like that. And so I've been on both sides of the table. I've been a networker, I've been networked with, and I'm happy to talk about both sides. But tonight, let's talk a little bit more about what we're going to cover. And I want to emphasize one more thing about why it matters before we get into the specific channels of networking. And so, unfortunately, like I was saying, due to the complexity, the networking is really what's going to make you stand out. And I keep harping on this point because it's so critical to understand that even a couple of years ago, the networking was less critical than it is today. Like you could usually get in if you had an incredible resume, but didn't have referrals at some of these top banks and private equity firms. And so the reason I'm mentioning this a lot more in 2026 than I was even in 2025 is because these days we're seeing star-studded resumes with 4.0 GPAs, several internship experiences at top PE and search funds and things like that, getting tossed in the bin because they don't have enough referrals. So how do you do it? Well, there's really two channels to networking. There's proprietary networking, which is you outreaching to individuals, and there's headhunter-driven networking. which is working with intermediator firms, recruiters, headhunters to actually get connected with the people that you need to talk with. Now, tonight, we're not going to talk about headhunters. That's primarily a concept that's useful for a private equity interviewing, but it's something that I want to return to at some point in the future. So stay tuned. We will talk about it eventually. But if you're still not convinced, which is hard to believe after this point, there's a few other things that come out of networking beyond just building advocates at the firm. And so I want to talk through the other benefits, because a lot of people, they say, hey, Max, like I've already got referrals at the bank that I'm interested in. Can I stop networking? And I say, no, you cannot stop networking. Never stop networking. And there's a few reasons why. The first is because it also helps you learn. And this is especially true for those of you who don't just want to go to like, the biggest brand name bulge bracket out there. If you want to go to a boutique or you want to go to an interesting group, like you don't want to just do generalists, like you want to do oil and gas banking or metals and mining, or you want to go into private equity and you're not sure what the difference is between a Thoma Bravo and a Vista Equity, you've got to learn. And a lot of this stuff isn't online. And so in order to learn what you want, you've got to talk to people. The second reason why this is so unbelievably important is because you're also able to learn about specific firms. And so again, when it comes back to learning the difference between a Thoma Bravo and a Vista Equity, or learning the difference between a Goldman Sachs and a Morgan Stanley, like you're not going to be able to just digest that off of some online forum. Like, sure, you can read some answers to that, but fundamentally a good why Goldman question is going to start with having conversations with folks and learning the intricate differences between these different firms. And so if you want to ace your behaviorals, to some extent, you have to ace your network. Then the third piece is learning about individual jobs. And this is especially true for those of you who are recruiting for off-cycle positions or don't already have something in like the current sophomore wave. Like a lot of this comes down to networking, because many of these jobs don't get posted on Handshake or LinkedIn or Indeed or something like that. And so if you want to get these jobs, you've got to be in front of the right people at the right time. Then there's the building advocates, getting referrals, getting references to other people. It just creates positive synergies in your life from a networking perspective. But the last thing that I'll leave you with before we get into the how is the single most important thing that networking can provide for you, which is practice. And so throughout my career, again, I've done over 1,000 networking calls myself, and that makes me so much more capable of talking about myself, answering, tell me about yourself, talking about why I'm interested in banking and private equity and who I am and what I'm trying to do. And so if you think you're good at behaviorals, take a second look. Once you've gotten through 1,000 networking calls where you've had a chance to repeat those in 1,000 different flavors, you'll be so much better than where you are today. So let's talk through 3 things tonight. The first conversation I want to have is figuring out who you should be reaching out to. Second, I want to teach you how to reach out to them effectively. And then third, how to prepare for these conversations. So first off, who should you be talking to? Let's break this down. And the way that I like to do it is by thinking about like a funnel. You want your proprietary networking to be a funnel where you start with like, okay, here's the market. And then there's specific banks and specific people and specific connections that you want to have within those. And so it comes down to some extent to understanding what you're actually looking for. And so the first thing you probably need to understand is the type. Are you sort of person who wants to work at like an elite boutique? Do you want to work at a bulge bracket? Do you want to work at a mid-market bank, a lower middle market bank? And I, of course, can help advise you on each of those points because they're not the same. And not one is necessarily better than others. I know a lot of people go for, again, the largest, biggest bulge bracket brand out there, but there's incredible experiences to be had at elite boutiques and regional boutiques, mid-markets, everything in between. The second thing you need to understand is the type of deals that you want to work on, the mandate here, because there's a huge difference in your analyst experience between working at an ECM firm, doing IPO work, doing debt raises, doing FIG, versus traditional M&A or something like that. And so there's different flavors that you need to be able to understand what you want and be able to explain that clearly to the people that you're talking to. And then there's sectors. And so in addition to understanding the type of deals that you want to do, you've got to know what sectors you want to do those deals in. So are you going to do it in tech? Are you going to do it in healthcare? Are you going to do industrials, metals and mining, or oil and gas? There's dozens of different sectors, and fundamentally they require different technicals, different behaviorals, and a different understanding of the industry to have a shot at getting them down. And then last but not least, geography. This is a classic one. Many people know exactly where they want to be, but if you don't, you've got to figure that out before your networking is going to be that effective. So if that all sounds like a lot to talk about, like please do feel free to book a call. happy to talk a little bit more and get you the support that you need in terms of understanding where exactly you want to build your career. And so I'm just going to type this link in the chat for those of you who are watching and who want to grab some time. This is going to be a very, very important and valuable strategy session. If you're not already in the recruiting process, you need to understand where you want to build your career. But once you've got the market, you also need to figure out what the firms are in that market. And so for those of you who are familiar with like market lingo, a TAM is your total addressable market, and a SAM is your specific addressable market. And so if the TAM is investment banking, your SAM is going to be the specific firms that you're interested in working with within finance. And so this is going to require you to do a lot of homework to understand fundamentally, again, what is the difference between JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley? And what's the difference between Bank of America and Citi? And like they all kind of look the same on the outside until you do your research and understand that, in fact, there's very different cultures, very different areas of expertise that you need to be able to articulate effectively. And so once you've figured out the market, you've got to map out the firms. And typically I recommend that students I work with map out about 100 of the firms that they're interested in networking with. And so they build a spreadsheet that has the bank, the types of groups, the geographies that they're interested in, and potentially any contacts that they already have at those firms in a massive spreadsheet that will keep them organized. But once you've got that, you've got to figure out who to actually reach out to. And so that's the third step of this funnel here, is making sure that you know the actual people to connect with here. And there's a few different stages here. The first is, of course, talking to the warm intro people. And so you want to talk with your family members, your friends, your cousin who's in banking, anyone that you know that's already currently in the finance industry, reach out to them first. But beyond that, you've got to find affinity groups. And so a lot of people, when I say that, they say, oh, I'll just go find school alumni. And that's great. I did that when I was recruiting as well. I looked for people that went to the same undergrad as me, but that wasn't enough. Because pretty quickly, especially if you're not going to NYU or Wharton, you work your way through that alumni list. And even if you do go to NYU or Wharton, you're probably going to be reaching out to the exact same people as 500 other classmates of yours. And so you need to find distinct groups of people to connect with. And so some of the other ideas I have there is try connecting with people that did previous internships the same as you. Maybe you worked at a SaaS startup during your freshman year of school, and you can reach out to people that also worked in that business that then went on to do finance. Maybe you are a lacrosse player and you can find people who are on the lacrosse team at your school. Or for me, I started looking for keywords for hobbies. And so in my most recent networking pushes, I've actually been doing keyword searches on LinkedIn for people that like play the cello like me or like scuba diving like me. And that made for a really good cold email. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to apply that in a second. And then if you work your way through that, you're going to have to go to truly cold outreach. And I say that cold outreach is avoidable whenever possible because you're going to get a less than a 10% response rate on those. These days, in fact, it might be in the low to mid single digits response rates relative to 20% plus if you have a killer cold email for a warm connection. The last things I'll say on terms of determining the actual people to reach out to is start with the analysts, work your way up. You don't want to make a stupid mistake. You don't want to sound silly. You don't want to be able to not articulate why it is that you're interested in Goldman Sachs at the managing director level. You want to make those mistakes pretty early on with summer analysts, associates, and VPs because they get less forgiving the more senior you go. So with that, at that point, all you've got to do is fundamentally send messages. And again, we're going to talk a little bit about how to get you a cold email that hopefully gets you to up to like a 20, 30% plus response rate, like I get on some of my cold email outreach. But fundamentally, that's going to take a lot of work. And so don't be discouraged if you don't get there right away. But there's a couple other tools that you're probably going to need to understand here. Like you're going to want to make sure that you're using ZoomInfo, Apollo.io, Hunter.io, RocketReach to make sure that you're actually getting the right email addresses. And then you also want to make sure that you have an email tracker. Now, this is something a lot of people miss is that, in fact, yes, you can track emails. Like I can see if you open my email and you can see if you open my email if you get the right software. And so make sure that you're finding an email tracker so that you're able to understand, are people opening your emails, period, or are you sending it to the wrong address to begin with? And so there are free Chrome extensions for that. Feel free to book a call with our team or send me a note on LinkedIn or something like that if you can't figure them out, and I can send over what those are. And then beyond that, it's just volume. Now, when I wrote this, I said 10 emails a day because that's sort of a good baseline standard for people who are going through recruiting at any given point in time. However, right now, we're currently going through the peak of sophomore recruiting cycles for summer 2027. And so if you're in that situation, unfortunately, 10 emails a day just isn't going to cut it. Like, you really need to push hard and fast to get some of the referrals and get some of the connections that you need. And so although you can't always control the response rates of your emails, you can control how many people you reach out to. And now would be the time to triple, quadruple, or even 10x that on a daily basis. But that's a lot of emails. And so in order to do this well, you need to stay organized. So if you don't have a tracker already, try and get an Excel tracker going immediately. And this is something, again, that I can help support you with. If you don't have something like this, we can help provide templates and things like that. But fundamentally, it's pretty simple. You just got to have the name, you got to have the group, the people that you're working with, and the next date of outreach. That's the critical piece that a lot of people miss, is the next date of outreach. And your networking is only going to be as good as your systems are, because there's no way that you can remember, oh, hey, I'm supposed to follow up with 200 people tomorrow. Let me just remember that in my brain. No, you've got to have systems. Otherwise, you're going to forget these things and you're going to miss out on following up with the people that you need to be networking with. Now let's get into the magic of how to actually reach out to them. And so I'm going to share my email strategy that I've developed over the last decade or so, and that I actually started learning when I was in sales. And so I worked in B2B SaaS sales, working on multi-million-dollar accounts, doing cold outreach to try and get people to buy software. And if you can sell something, you can send a good email. And so here's what I arrived at after all that practice. And it's pretty dang simple. Most people, the first thing that they notice about this template is that it is short. There's really not a lot here. It's something like a half dozen sentences maximum.
What?
And
Wait.
so part of that, please make sure that you're on mute, by the way, just in case anyone comes off there. Thank you. Okay, so part of that is because you really don't need more than that to get a good email out here. And fundamentally, it's got to be short. Otherwise, people just aren't going to have the time to look through it, because you're talking with people whose time is worth hundreds of dollars an hour. They're rushing between things. They're constantly getting blown up by their bosses, and they're trying to send things out, jump on client calls. And so if they can't see your email on their phone in like a 2-second period and read it, they're not going to follow along. And so let's dissect what's going on here. We got 5 pieces here. So the first piece is a hook. This is the single most important part of your email, because a lot of times, if it's bad, it's the only thing they're ever going to read. And so the hook is fundamentally something that's designed to catch them, to grab their attention, to shake them up and say, hey, I should talk with Max. And so hooks that I think work are other-centric and they're flattering. And so what do I mean by that? Well, other-centric, I mean like focused on the other person. They're not focused on you. Like, your hook isn't like, I'm Max, I'm great. Your hook is something like, hey, you're great. And so it's got to be a little bit of flattering. It's got to be still focused on them. And so what are some of the things that you can use for hooks? Well, the first one, as you can see in the example here, is like a promotion. That's a classic one. If they got promoted recently, congratulate them on it. Anywhere in the last few months is probably appropriate. Or if they're like a managing director, even in the last year or so is probably still pretty recent on the time frame of their career. The second is if they switched firms. So if you're talking with someone who just lateraled over to another firm or just got a job or something like that, that's great. Congratulate them on that. Ask how it's going. Third, if they're celebrating a major work anniversary. This one can sound a little corny, but believe it or not, a lot of my networking success has been on saying something like, hey, congratulations on the 5-year mark at your firm, or hitting the 1-year mark, or the 2-year mark as an analyst. That's great. That sort of stuff, believe it or not, people like that you're paying attention to it. And then fourth, if they posted about any deals, or you can find somehow that they've worked on or may have worked on an interesting deal, you can say, congratulations on the XYZ transaction that you just worked on. And that leads to sort of a warm hook. Now, beyond that, if you can't get that, then you can try to use your affinity connection with them. And so you can say something to the effect of like, great to see another cellist working in private equity. And so that indicates to them, hey, someone knows something interesting about me and they've got something in common. Or, it's a little lamer, but you could say, great to see a fellow XYZ school alumni working at a great firm, or something like that. And so just something to immediately put front and center that you have something in common with them, that works. Now, if you truly cannot find anything, then you can go with the classic, boring, useless, hope you're doing well. I'm not going to recommend that, but it's certainly better than nothing. Okay, so that's the first sentence. That's the hook. The reason I spend so much time on that is because often, again, that's the only thing that they look at if it's bad. If it's good, they'll keep reading. And so the second thing that they'll see is context. Like, who are you and why are you reaching out to me? Why are you cluttering my inbox? Well, you've got to get that immediately out there as quickly as possible. And commonly, people make a mistake of typing out paragraphs here. They'll have their background, they'll have the school that they went to, why they're interested in investment banking, they'll have their grandmother's apple pie recipe, you name it. And so there's some emails that I get as a finance professional where I literally just immediately delete it because I just don't have the time to read that much context. But you can usually get everything you need to over in one sentence: who you are, what you're trying to do. That's all you need to communicate. And so then you've got to tie it back to them. And so not just, hey, what are you trying to do, but why are you trying to do something that relates to them? And so that's, again, where there's a touch of flattery and specificity that comes in. And so when I was recruiting for tech banks, I would say something to the effect of, hey, tech banking is my area of focus, and nobody does that better than XYZ Bank. And you could even potentially mention a deal that they did, if you didn't already, to emphasize that a little bit. And then the last piece on here is the call to action. And again, this is commonly messed up because a lot of people, they have a very long call to action and they have like a period at the end of it. And so they say, it'd be great if we could connect, period. Or I really would love to hear back. Let me know what you think, period, or something like that. And that's not an action. Like, what did you ask for? And so theoretically, the banker could just be like, well, they didn't ask for anything, delete. You, however, are going to put a question mark at the end of your email. You're going to have a very clear ask of what do you want to do when. And so the way I phrase this, I've iterated over the years, and I think that it works better than anything else I've seen. Have a minute to chat next Wednesday or Friday morning. Now, sometimes people would say that you should say, oh, do you have a minute to chat? And that's fine. But the way that this phrasing right here is magical is because it changes the question in their mind from not do I have time to chat, but when do I have time to chat? And so that's going to be even more powerful because they're just already taking it for granted subliminally that they're going to talk with you and that the question that they have to decide is when. And then you'll also note that the time buckets I provided are optimally broad and narrow. Now, if you say too broad, you say, hey, do you have time to talk next month? They're going to be like, I don't know, like, I don't know what I'm doing next month. That's too big. Or conversely, if you say, do you have 15 minutes to chat from 12:07 to 12:22 p.m. next Thursday afternoon, like that's going to be too specific. And so listing out like 12 bullet points of times, it's just going to overload them. And so provide two sufficiently broad windows like Wednesday or Friday morning next week that they can react to productively. Now, last but not least, include your information at the bottom. And so a couple things here. First off, I include my phone number, I include my LinkedIn, and I include my calendar booking link. If you don't already have a calendar booking link, I'd probably get one. Most bankers probably won't use it, but every once in a while, it makes it a little bit easier for them to say yes. Now, notably, what you will not see on my resume or on my notes is my resume. A lot of the conventional wisdom is that you should include a resume in your email. And you can try that, but I've seen in 2026 that it actually hurts deliverability sometimes. And so including a resume sometimes can make it so that Gmail or whatever email server they're using actually blocks your resume and blocks your email from coming through. And so if you're getting your email tracker and you're seeing that people aren't even opening the email in the first place, it might be because you have a bad subject, or it might just be because it's going to spam because you include a lot of attachments or links or something like that in your email that looks suspicious. Now, last thing I'll touch on before we move through here is that the hook here can also be used as a subject line. And so if you're feeling bold, take the hook, put it up in the subject line. If you're feeling a little less bold, then you can just do something simpler like name, max, intro. So luckily, what you'll notice about this email is it's actually short enough for LinkedIn. And we'll come back to this in a second. We'll talk about some of the pros and cons, but just note that this template can work for both. So let's talk about a cadence though, because realistically, this email here is not just going to be enough to get you a job. You're going to have to email them multiple times. You're going to have to follow up. You're going to have to demonstrate persistence in a way that otherwise you wouldn't be able to. And so I typically recommend 5 touch points in a conversation with people. The first is an intro email, similar to the previous slide. The second is a simple reminder follow-up email. And in this email, I typically like to make sure that they have an out. What do I mean? Well, I want to make sure that they feel emotionally like they didn't let me down for not responding. And I usually give them a little bit of grace. I give them an excuse. And so I say something to the effect of, hey, I know things have been really busy. Still love to talk if you have time next Tuesday or Thursday. And so it just gives them an acknowledgement like, yeah, I know you've been busy and it's totally fine. And it just bumps it up to the top of the inbox and provides a call to action. It's like 2 sentences, takes 5 seconds, going to be super fast. Then, if you didn't already start on LinkedIn, I like to hit them with a 1-2 punch of a LinkedIn and a third email. And so the LinkedIn, I will just send basically literally my intro email on LinkedIn to them. And then I will follow up with a more substantive third email that attempts to re-engage them. And so that can be something that like has a stock pitch attached to it. It can have an industry trend. It can have a deal analysis, and basically tries to get them on an intellectual level to be curious about what you're saying. And then last but not least, if you truly have to talk with someone, you can send a creative sort of follow-up email, like maybe a meme or something like that. Like you can just get creative. It's like they're probably not going to respond at that point. As long as it's professional, anything that you can do to get their attention is on the table. So that's going to be the cadence here. But let's talk a little bit more about this question of LinkedIn versus email, because I get this all the time. So for me, I found that email is really nice because you can see ultimately if they opened it, and you can email them multiple times, and you can potentially include some attachments later on. And so I generally don't send, again, the resume on my first email, but later on I might send a case study or attach an article or something like that. And that's valuable, easier to do on email than LinkedIn. LinkedIn, however, though, is very, very powerful because of its speed and its accuracy. And in a day where there's just tons of people with random Gmail accounts emailing everyone, it gives you personal credibility where they can click through and they can see, hey, okay, this is a real person. There's not a bot here. And so for those reasons, especially the speed, I've actually almost exclusively shifted my networking to LinkedIn. There are downsides for sure, but it just enables me to crank out that many more messages that much faster. And for that reason, I have to buy LinkedIn Pro so I can hit those usage limits, because otherwise you run into it pretty fast. But it's a personal call. You can do whatever you like. For more important outreach, sometimes I still do email, but a lot of the times it's LinkedIn. So with that, again, if you don't know what's better, happy to talk a little bit more. Would love to have a conversation and hear about your networking strategy, but we need to finish by talking about how to actually have a good conversation, because you just went through a ton of work to figure out who to email, how to email them. And if you fumble it in the actual conversation, then like, what was that all for? And so let's talk a little bit about how to ace that conversation once you've gone to the trouble to get someone actually on the phone. So the call structure needs to begin with preparation. Now, you know this. I'm not saying anything crazy here, but research the firm. Figure out what their strategy is. Figure out what the news is about them, what the buzz is, what their reputation is. If they're a private equity firm, learn what their portfolio companies are. If they're an investment bank, learn what deals they've done. Second, figure out the individual. So not just the firm, but also the person that you're talking with. You need to find any points of connection possible. Now, don't get creepy, like don't go stalk them or anything like that. But if they have publicly facing social media, like go check it out. If they've published an article on LinkedIn, go read it. Like make sure that you know what is knowable about them so you can build those subtle points of connection on the call. And then last but not least, review your prior points of contact. And so that's, again, this is an organizational game. And so remember that spreadsheet that I was talking about a minute ago? You need to make sure that you've got very clear notes about who the people are, when you last talked with them, what you talked about, that sort of stuff. And so I have a Google Doc that links in with my spreadsheet, and I make sure that prior to the call, I go back and I check the Google Doc and I'm like, oh yeah, last time we talked about this. Yep. Okay, cool. And the reason I've done that is because I've made the mistake of not doing that. And so, for example, I did a call last summer, I think it was, and I was networking for this firm, and I was really excited about it. And I got on the phone with this guy, and I was like, "Oh, like I'm really excited about your firm. It seems great. You know, I'd really love to hear about your career and your background and things like that." And he said, he looks at me kind of funny. He's like, "Max, we talked like 3 weeks ago. Do you not remember?" and I just like face palmed so hard. Like it was one of the more embarrassing calls I've ever had. And I recovered. I was able to apologize. You know, I was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Totally forgot. Yeah, we talked about that." So I smoothed it over. But I really would have saved myself if I'd just taken my own advice and actually remembered to look at my notes beforehand. But once you prepare for the call, you got to make sure you've got good structure on it. And so the structure I recommend is 4 parts. You got small talk, you got context, you got questions, and you've got an ask. And so on the small talk, this really matters. Like, don't skip that. Follow their lead, because some people are like more straight to business than others, but don't skip that. And I've also made the mistake of skipping that. And so last year I was interviewing for a different firm, and I had this interview, and it was an hour long, and like it went pretty well. After the first few minutes of chit chat, I was like, okay, let's get down to business. Like, I'm happy to share who I am, yada, yada, yada. Answered the questions well, thought I crushed it, had great behaviorals, answered the technicals, and I didn't get the follow-up. And so afterwards, I reached out to the interviewer. I was like, hey, I thought it was a really good call. Just wanted to check in if you had any feedback for me. And the guy emailed me back and he said two things. He said, first off, Max, whatever keyboard you're using is so freaking loud. So side note, don't have a really, really loud clackety keyboard on a networking call. But the more important feedback he gave me was, he said, Max, like we were looking at hiring you for like a very serious role, and we were going to pay you and we were going to like work with you for a long time. And you sort of thought that we were going to do that without getting to know you as a human being. Like, really? Because I'd skipped through some of the networking. I'd rushed it. I spent a few minutes on it, but I didn't follow his cadence. And so be responsive and socially intelligent to the cues that the interviewer is giving you in terms of how long they want to talk about whatever. And if you can spend the entire interview, the technical interview, talking about their canoeing and their lake house at Tahoe, like do it. That's going to be such a better conversation and such a better reference afterwards than if you went the other way around and spent the entire time answering technicals. But at some point, the conversation flips. And so that's where you've got to tie it back to them, tie it back to the conversation. And so usually what this goes like is something to the effect of like, oh my gosh, that's so cool to hear about your lake house at Tahoe. Like, I'm so honored that you took the time to talk with me. You must be jet lagged. And I'm really, really glad that I have the chance to even hear about your experience at XYZ private equity firm. And so that was sort of a smooth tie where I acknowledged that like it was extenuating that they talked to me, and I tied it back to the gratitude for the conversation. And so at that point, I'll usually say something to the effect of, well, hey, like, I'm happy to share a little bit more about myself, but realistically, I just want to learn about your background and how you ended up at this firm. And so that's a good line. I'm happy to share more about myself, but more, I really want to learn about XYZ specific thing. Because instead of forcing them to hear about my 5-minute life story, I give them the option, but not the obligation. And that sets things up really well to move directly into questions where I say, I really want to hear about XYZ thing. And then I spend the rest of the conversation asking those questions. And so the rule of thumb I have here is never ask something that's Googleable, and probably have one question for every 2 to 3 minutes of the call. If you're a networking pro, you probably only need a half dozen questions for a 30-minute conversation. But if this is your first networking call, you probably want one question for every 2 minutes just to be sure that you don't run out of content. Now, the questions are not all made equal. And so I want to spend just a second double clicking on the quality of questions. First off, yes or no questions, boring, fast, gonna waste a bunch of time. Second, questions that you can Google and you can like find the answer online or something like that, like not worth their time, not worth your time. They're gonna perceive it as disrespectful, in fact. The second sort of thing that I would say about questions, or the third sort of thing I would say about questions, is that you want to ask questions that invite them to tell a story. And so anytime that you can, instead of saying like, what deals have you worked on? You can flip that to saying, tell me about the coolest deal that you worked on. That's going to invite a much more interesting and much more in-depth answer. And they're going to say, hey, like, I really feel you a little bit more. Like, I want to have more of a conversation. I want to tell you about that human to human, as opposed to just like reciting some facts. And so that's a pretty magical phrasing. Tell me about XYZ. And then last but not least, the best conversations come when you can actually get off the script. And so follow-up questions in particular are the single best tool that you can have for asking good questions in a networking conversation, because it shows that you can follow the conversation, you can understand what's going on, you can think on your feet and like follow their energy. And so if you're talking with someone and you ask about a deal that they worked on, and they really light up. They're like, wow, that was such a cool deal. And like, let me tell you about that. Then you can ask about it some more. You can say, oh, tell me about the industry. Why did you do that? Oh, that's so interesting. You can gas them up and sort of follow the energy that they, as the interviewer, or as the person that you're networking with, have. Conversely, if they seem really bored by what question that you just asked, like move on. Don't keep asking that same question in different forms. Okay. I've talked a lot about the structure here. We talked about the small talk, the transition, and the questions that you should ask. But again, this is all for naught unless you actually make an ask at the end. Now, for a lot of people, this is the single most important and single most dreadful part of the call, because they spend the entire half hour like being like, oh, I really don't want to ask them for a job at the end. And the good news is you don't have to ask them for a job, but you do have to ask them for something. And so I want to walk through what that looks like and what you should be asking for to avoid having wasted your time and wasted their time with a call where nothing actually happened. So the first thing I say when I'm making my ask at the end of the call is I affirm the conversation. I say, hey, I really enjoyed our conversation. I loved hearing about XYZ deal. And it seems like your firm is going to be like exactly the sort of place I'd want to look at. And then I followed up with an innocuous question. I kind of play dumb. I say, do you know if there are any positions opening up soon? Now, realistically, in on-cycle recruiting, where you know that there are positions opening, you might have to rephrase this a little bit and say something like, I know that there's a position open, and then you can ask the next question. But if you don't actually know and it's off-cycle or something like that, this is a fine question to ask. You can say, do you know what the hiring needs are? Like, what are people looking for? And that enables them to have a conversation about you as a candidate, and that reframes you in their mind as someone who's really interested in getting the job. And so if they say, yeah, we do have some firms open, then, or you've got some positions open, then you ask about referrals. And so the way I phrase that is, oh, that's great. Like, and do you know if there's a referral program? And that's not backing them into a corner saying, give me a referral, but it's also not sort of letting it slide. Like, that's a pretty clear question where if they liked you, they can say yes. And if they don't like you, they can say, actually, I'm not sure how that works. They can play dumb. If you get that and they say yes, gold star. If they don't, though, you're not done yet. You can still ask for a reference. And so here, I would say, no worries. I totally get it. I don't know what the referral process program looks like either. That's totally fine. But that said, like, I've really enjoyed our conversation and I would love to keep learning about your firm. Is there anyone else you'd recommend I reach out to? And this phrasing is gold. It's gold for two reasons. First off, it reaffirms the conversation. It says, I really enjoyed learning about it. And the second, it says, I'm going to take the effort to actually find the people to reach out to. Just tell me the name and I'll reach out to them. It's a very low lift for them. And since they just rejected you on the first point, they're going to be more likely to respond to your second request in some ways because they might feel a little bit bad that they didn't give you a referral. And so say, oh, at least give them a reference. And so on the reference here, if they say yes to that, great. You just did your networking for you. Like they made it easy. You're going to have a really warm outreach. It's going to be a great response rate, great conversation. But if they say no again, you're still not done. You want to finish by asking for mentorship. And so you say, no worries. I really enjoyed our conversation and appreciated your mentorship. Would it be okay if I keep you updated on my progress? And again, this is a psychological hack where you're framing them specifically as a mentor to you. And you're saying, you are my mentor, and you're putting that in their mind so that they think, hey, yeah, I'm someone who's committed to this person's help. And so if that goes well, great. At least you've got someone that you can follow up with in the future. And realistically, I've never actually had anyone say no to that. So this is the ask. This is something that's very, very important, but there's one more thing you need to do before you're done with the conversation. And that's a thank you note. So a lot of people forget this, or they send a really crappy thank you note. And so the thank you note needs to come in 24 hours, ideally the same day. It needs to have a specific callback to the call. Like if you could write that thank you note to 2 different people, it's not specific enough. And third, it needs to follow up. So you just went through and you did these asks. If you don't follow up on that, they're probably going to forget. And even if you do follow up on it, half the time they're still going to ghost you. But if you don't ask for it, they almost certainly will not get you what you want. And so that comes to the concluding thought I have here. And then I want to open up to some questions, which is realistically, networking is about building relationships for people and asking for the things that you need. If you don't ask for it, you're not going to get it. If you don't reach out to people, you're not going to get it. And so this is something that is extraordinarily important for your success as professionals. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And please, whatever else you take from this, take it very seriously that networking is probably the single greatest tool that you can get from the investment banking recruiting process. It will help you so much in everything that you're doing for investment banking recruiting, private equity recruiting, MBA recruiting, whatever else you're trying to do in life. Invest in building the skill now, and you'll be paid dividends down the line. So with that, hope you all have a great rest of your night, and hope to see you on the inside if we haven't already talked.